There are words in the world that outlive any state, religion, or empire. They originated in ancient times as simple self-designations, and thousands of years later suddenly turned into symbols of power, superiority, and disputes over who has the right to call this land their own. And the word Aryans is one of them. It was not used to name a race, measure skulls, or search for pure blood. But at some point, this ancient word was torn from its own time and made to serve completely different purposes. And to understand who these Aryans really were, we have to go back to a time when there were no political slogans or history textbooks. Welcome to the Amazing History channel. Here we examine the past without simplifications or convenient legends, and today the topic requires exactly this approach. Because behind it lie not only ancient eras but also very modern debates. Before I continue, I want to thank our sponsors. It is thanks to your support that the channel releases long, in-depth historical videos. Thank you to everyone who supports the project and gives us the opportunity to calmly talk about complex things. Now let's get to the topic of this episode. Let's go. First, let's set aside almost everything that the word Aryans is associated with today. In the ancient world, it did not mean a people and certainly not a race. It was a self-designation, primarily connected with status and way of life. In early Iranian and Indian texts, this word is used to denote someone worthy, noble, one of their own. That is, someone who lives by established rules and shares a common worldview. Simply put, Aryan is not someone born with a certain skin color, but rather someone who recognizes a certain order, speaks a common language, and follows shared rituals and norms of behavior. It's important to understand that for people of the Bronze Age, the very idea of race in the modern sense simply didn't exist. Their world was simpler. Insiders and outsiders were defined by belonging to a community, by way of life, and by the ability to fit into the collective. It was in this context that the word Aryan was used. Later, this self-designation became established in tradition. It entered religious texts and became part of the language. But at this stage, there is not even a hint of the superiority of some people over others based on innate traits. That is, the history of the Aryans does not begin as the story of some mythical race, but as the story of people defined by a particular way of life, shaped by specific conditions and in a specific era. The history of the Aryans begins long before the appearance of written sources. We are talking about the period of the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, approximately between the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. At this time, the vast expanses of the Eurasian steppes from the Black Sea region to the areas of modern Kazakhstan and the southern Urals become a zone of active human movement and cultural contacts. It was a world without states and the cities we are familiar with. Most communities survived through livestock herding and seasonal migrations, adapting to the climate and access to pastures. Settled life was rare here. But mobility was a vital necessity. It was under these conditions that a special type of society developed, where the ability to move quickly and adapt was valued more than control over a specific territory. In the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, the steppe became a real crossroads of cultures. Here, the paths of different groups intersect, exchanging not only goods but also technologies, language elements, and worldviews. In this environment, a region gradually takes shape. Common cultural and linguistic features emerge, which researchers will later call Indo-Iranian. These were not yet the Aryans, but it is here that the foundation is formed from which they will emerge. For people of that time, moving hundreds of kilometers was not seen as migration in the modern sense. It was a normal way of life. Therefore, the future Aryan groups originally lived in a world where contact with other cultures was inevitable. It was from this environment that, by the end of the 3rd and the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, separate groups began to gradually move south toward the Iranian plateau and the Indian subcontinent. This would be a long process of dispersal that would stretch over centuries and become the foundation for subsequent cultural changes. Earlier, the Aryans did not live behind city walls, but were constantly on the move, and it was this movement that was the basis of their survival. Their economy was built primarily around livestock farming. Cattle, sheep, and goats were not just sources of food, but also the foundation of the social order. The size and condition of the herds determined the prosperity of the clan, its influence, and its ability to survive in difficult conditions. After all, the larger and healthier the herds, the wealthier the clan was, and the easier it was for them to survive crop failures, droughts, and cold weather. The life of such communities was governed by seasonal rhythms. In spring and summer, the herds were driven to rich pastures. In winter, they looked for more sheltered areas. These migrations were repeated year after year, forming stable routes. People knew where they could wait out a drought, where there was water, and where they could safely camp. The settlements of the early Aryans were temporary and easy to dismantle. This allowed them to quickly change location without being tied to one place. The social structure was built around the clan. Elders played a key role as bearers of memory and tradition. Decisions were made collectively, but authority and experience carried weight. Exchanges and contacts with neighbors played an important role. Simply put, these were ordinary deals. Livestock was exchanged for metal, hides for grain, and along with these, words, customs, and gods spread as well. It was through such contacts that elements of language, beliefs, and technologies spread. This process was slow but steady, and over time it created a sense of cultural unity, even among groups that were far apart from each other. The horse played a special role in this way of life. In the popular imagination, it is almost automatically associated with war and raids, but for the early Aryans, the horse was primarily a means of transportation. It made it possible to accompany herds, move quickly between seasonal camps, and maintain contact between scattered related groups. Carts with solid wheels enhanced this effect. With their help, people transported belongings, supplies, children, and the elderly. In other words, everything that made a nomadic lifestyle possible, not only for warriors but for the entire community. It was a logistics technology, not a weapon of conquest. The familiar image of the Aryans as warlike conquerors appeared much later than the Aryans themselves. It largely arises from the habit of viewing the ancient world through the lens of later empires, where war was the main instrument of politics. For early Aryan communities, this approach would have been impractical. Their way of life was not conducive to constant military campaigns, let alone large-scale conquests. In the steppe environment, war was a great risk. The loss of people meant the loss of labor force, defenders, herds, and experienced members of the community. Unlike sedentary societies with high population density, steppe groups could not afford prolonged conflicts without threatening their own existence. Therefore, clashes certainly occurred, but most often they were local in nature and were related to access to resources, not with the idea of subjugating foreign territories. The military affairs of the early Aryans did not have a clear organized structure. Forget about professional armies, centralized command, or permanent retinues. In case of conflict, the same people who herded cattle and managed households during peacetime would take up arms. For them, war was something they were forced into and did not want. Later texts, especially epic ones, do indeed create an image of heroic battles and warriors in chariots. It is important to remember that these works record already reworked memories, reflecting the values of later societies. They speak not so much about the reality of the early period as about how the descendants wanted to see the past. By the end of the 3rd and especially during the 2nd millennium BC, the world of the Eurasian steppes began to gradually change. Climatic fluctuations, population growth, and the depletion of familiar pastures forced many tribal groups to look for new routes. It was during this period that individual Aryan communities began to slowly move south and southeast, going beyond the familiar steppe zone. It should be clarified here that we are not talking about a single exodus like that of Moses or an organized campaign. This was a process that stretched over centuries, involving different groups and generations. Some went further, others returned or settled for a while, and still others blended into neighboring societies. Such movements resembled gradual spreading more than directed expansion. The southern route led primarily to the Iranian plateau, and then through the territories of present-day Afghanistan and Central Asia to the northwestern regions of the Indian subcontinent. There they encountered a completely different type of world. It was a world of settled societies, agriculture, permanent settlements, and complex economic systems. And people who were used to a mobile way of life had to seek balance, negotiate, and gain approval, rather than simply imposing their will by force. Archaeological data also do not show sharp breaks or traces of total destruction that one would expect from a large-scale invasion. On the contrary, in the economy, language, and rituals, new elements appear gradually without the old ones disappearing. This indicates a long period of coexistence and mutual influence rather than the replacement of one population by another. And it is precisely during these migrations that the Aryan cultural tradition begins to change. It loses some of its steppe characteristics and gradually absorbs elements from the new regions. This process cannot be described as one-sided. The people who arrived themselves came under the influence of those among whom they settled. This is how a new, more complex cultural reality was formed, the consequences of which would only become apparent centuries later. By the middle of the second millennium BC, groups we call the Aryans had long been present in northern Hindustan, but at this moment an important turning point occurs. The Aryans stop being just one of the communities that came from outside and become part of a larger and more stable world. It is here that what we call the Vedic period begins to take shape. The main change in this period is the gradual transition to a settled way of life. But this was not a sharp rejection of mobility, but rather the formation of stable settlements connected with agriculture and river valleys, while maintaining seasonal roots. People were still moving, but no longer across the endless steppe, but within settled territory. Society is becoming more complex, and with this comes the need for clear rules. Who is responsible for what? Why is power organized this way? And what, in fact, is the foundation of order? The Vedic tradition begins to provide answers to these questions. It is during this time that entire collections of Vedic texts are compiled. They were not created as a single sacred book, but were the result of a long oral tradition that was passed down from generation to generation. The recording of these texts in their true form happened much later, but their content reflects a much earlier period. Sanskrit played a special role in this process. In the Vedic world, it played a role similar to the one Latin would later play in Europe. That is, not the language of the street, but the language of ritual, knowledge, and authority. Hymns, sacrificial formulas, and ideas about how the world is structured and the place of humans in it are written in it. Most people spoke different local dialects, and this is what made Sanskrit special. It was used in areas where precision, immutability, and a connection to tradition were required. Thanks to this, the Vedic world maintained internal integrity even in the face of enormous cultural diversity. This order did not break existing traditions. Local cults, rituals, and beliefs were gradually reinterpreted and incorporated into the overall picture. Old deities received new names and functions, while local practices gained new explanations. Over time, the Vedic world became a convenient tool for governing and self-organization of society. It allows for explaining authority, social differences, and people's duties to each other without resorting to constant coercion. That is why this system begins to be perceived as normal and natural, while everything else is seen as a deviation from order. The social structure of Vedic society becomes more complex than that of early steppe communities. Gradually, divisions of functions and responsibilities begin to form, related to ritual, military affairs, and everyday household management. That is, priests, warriors, craftsmen, and farmers begin to appear. This was not yet a rigid hierarchy, but already an attempt to organize a society that was no longer in constant motion, but in a relatively stable state. The economy is also changing. Animal husbandry still plays an important role, but agriculture is becoming increasingly significant. Settlements are becoming more permanent, and control over territory is more significant than before. Thus, the world of steppe roots transitions into a world of rivers, valleys, and cultivated lands. It's no coincidence that the key area of the Vedic period becomes the plains connected to major river systems. But the Aryans were not only in India. While some groups gradually moved south toward Hindustan, others remained on the Iranian plateau and in the surrounding regions. It was from them that the Iranian branch of the Aryan world was formed, which developed in parallel with the Indian branch. By the second millennium BC, the Aryan groups in Iran were already firmly connected with the local environment. Their world consists of mountain valleys, plateaus, and semi-desert zones where mobility is still important, but agriculture and settled communities play an increasingly significant role. Here, a unique cultural tradition is formed, in many ways related to the Vedic one, but following its own path. The main source for understanding this world is the Avesta, the sacred collection of texts associated with Zoroastrianism. Like the Vedas, the Avesta records a much more ancient oral culture. The Avestan language is so close to Vedic Sanskrit that many words are recognizable. Terms related to worship, gods, sacrifices, the order of the world, and social life clearly come from a common heritage. But even at this stage, the differences become fundamental. If in the Vedic world we see a complex system of gods and rituals, then in the Iranian tradition the idea of a stricter moral order gradually takes shape. The opposition between truth and lies, the right and wrong path, becomes central. This is one of the key features of future Zoroastrianism. The attitude towards war also changes. If in the early steppe world conflict was part of everyday life, then in the Iranian tradition the moral evaluation of violence is increasingly emphasized. War can be justified, but only if it is waged for the right order. Compared to earlier ideas, this was an important step towards the formation of a new religious ethic. It was from this environment that the major Iranian peoples and states would later emerge: the Medes, the Persians, and then the Achaemenid empires. All of this would not be the Aryan of the Bronze Age, but the result of a long historical development that began right here. It's no coincidence that the very name Iran comes from the ancient word Arya and literally means the land of the Aryans. But at some point, the Aryans began to be seen not as historical groups, but as a single people with a common origin, and later even as a distinct race. It was this substitution that gave rise to most of the debates, myths, and ideological constructs that still exist around the Aryans today. At the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, European scholars seriously began to study Sanskrit and ancient Indian texts for the first time. They discovered that Sanskrit is strikingly similar to Greek, Latin, and a number of other European languages. One of the first to publicly draw this conclusion was William Jones, who worked in colonial India. His idea about the relationship between languages became a scientific breakthrough. But then a crucial mistake occurs. Linguistic kinship begins to be interpreted as proof of a common origin of people. If languages are similar, then, reasoned the researchers of that time, their speakers must also come from the same people. Thus, the linguistic hypothesis turns into a historical one and then into a quasi-biological one. In search of a name for this hypothetical ancestral people, scholars turn to ancient texts and find the word Arya, which is already familiar to us. Its ancient meaning, associated with dignity and order, gradually fades into the background. Now this word begins to be used as a designation for a people, and later as a marker of superiority. Thus, the Bronze Age self-designation acquires a completely new alien meaning. What began as an attempt to understand the origins of languages turns into a story about conquests, claims of precedence, and the supposed original superiority of some over others. Thus, ancient Aryans begin to be sought in places where they never existed. The real history of people and cultures ends up being replaced by a convenient myth. And the further this idea drifts from its scientific source, the less it retains of antiquity and the more ideology of its own time it contains. So what do we have? Aryans are not an answer to the question of who is better, nor are they a tool for claiming exceptional status. This is an example of how cultures were formed in the ancient world. And perhaps it is in this, and not in the myths of superiority, that their real historical significance lies. That's all from me. Thank you for your attention and see you in upcoming videos. Goodbye, everyone.